I said, I don't understand why my clients are now telling me, often apropos of nothing, and often after the court proceedings, so there was no gain for them, that they were telling me that they'd been sexually abused when they were young. And I'm not asking them this question. And he said, it's because they know that I won't shame them. And I found that incredibly powerful. And it's incredible, although it sounds bad to say it's a burden, but I don't like to hear that my clients have been sexually abused or had terrible childhoods. But it's also a privilege that people feel confident enough to tell you that.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're really pleased to welcome along Iain Smith, who's into his 30th year as a lawyer. Iain started out in a civil firm where Robert Louis Stephenson trained, but in 1998 he created his own business with Jim Keegan, King's Counsel. Iain concentrated on crime, but also did children's referral hearings and acted as a sports lawyer for international rugby stars. In 2018, Iain describes himself as having an epiphany in reaction to being educated on the biological impact of trauma on the childhood brain. He suddenly saw his clients properly for the first time, and he then realised others didn't know about childhood trauma and the links to addiction and poor self-regulation. In December 2020, Iain co-created Trauma Aware Law with legal colleagues and pals from the Scottish Police Violence Reduction Unit. He's won a number of awards for his work, including 2020 Scottish Lawyer of the Year at the Scottish Legal Awards. We were lucky enough very recently to have Jim Keegan who won the English Lawyer of the Year awards in that year. 2021, he won the Herald Scottish Criminal Law Firm of the Year with his firm Keegan Smith. And in 2022, with his firm, won the Scottish Legal Awards Criminal Law Firm of the Year. And also that same year won the Herald Legal Awards Innovation Award for Trauma Aware Law, and he's been nominated for the Pro Bono Award. And the awards opened doors and gave credibility to Iain's campaigning. Iain's aim is to bring knowledge of trauma into the justice system and then persuade the players in it to change and create more compassionate outcomes for those who we perceive as baddies. Welcome, Iain. Glad to have you on.
Hi, nice to meet you both. Hi, Naomi, and to David as well.
Hi, Iain. Very good to meet you, and thanks very much for coming along. That's a very impressive record that Naomi has just been describing. So what attracted you to a career in law? Was this something you've always wanted to do?
So historically, my father was a police officer. My mother worked as a cashier in a law firm. So I guess I grew up with an interest in crime and criminal law. And I actually tried to join the Metropolitan Police when I was in 5th year at school, but I was too short and my eyesight was too poor for a Scottish police. But when my dad found out I wanted to join the Met, he soon dismissed that, thinking it was a very bad idea. And I ended up doing okay in my exams, such to get into Edinburgh Law School. And that's what I decided to do. So, yeah, that was me.
So, looking back, it looks like you had a lucky shave and not being signed up for the Met.
Yeah, I think so. Looking at it now, I wouldn't have been a good police officer, I don't think. I certainly wouldn't have been very good at certainly the physical aspects of some policing, but I have to say some of the best police officers I've met over the past 30 years tend not to use their batons or their spray, but tend to use their mouth and talking to people. And as much as I talk about trauma-informed law, there's a lot of community police officers who instinctively practice trauma-informed policing and get the fact that people struggle and that they don't require to be shouted at, but be spoken to in a dignified and respectful manner, and end up not having to use physical restraint and the like. It doesn't always work that way, but I've met many police officers who I think inadvertently practice trauma-informed policing. So I'm glad I'm not a police officer. I'm glad I'm a lawyer, but I'm also glad I changed how I practice law over the past 5 years.
Yeah, that's a very good description, I think, of a good police person. So you've become known for recognising the need to understand the role that trauma plays. Excuse me. To understand the role that trauma plays in criminal law work. How did you come to this realisation?
So in around November 2017, I met a lady called Leslie Udwin. You maybe not have heard of her, but she was voted by the New York Times Magazine in, I think, 2015 as the second most powerful woman on the planet, or second most powerful person on the planet behind Hillary Clinton. And Leslie followed and created a documentary called India's Daughter. And it was about the rape of a young Indian doctor on a bus by 6 men. It was quite a big case in Delhi and became celebrated because women in Delhi came out and rebelled against misogyny, male violence, rape of women, and how women were treated in society. And Leslie made this great documentary about following the men, following the story, and realised how mundane the men were, because they were portrayed as monsters, but she realised they weren't actually monsters. And I run a local community cinema, and she came up from London, screened her film, and we became friends. And she ended up creating a charity called Think Equal, all about early years development of children, and from a very early age about social emotional learning. And it sort of got me thinking about what was going on with my clients. And then in March 2018, I met people from the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, including Karen McCluskey and John Carnican. And they took me along to see a film called Resilience, made by the late and great James Redford, son of Robert Redford. And that was all about what was going on in America, about the study by Ander and Felitti from 95, the impact of stress and toxic stress on the young brain, everything that you guys know about. But as a lawyer, rather unfortunate, I didn't know about that. So I spent around 25 years of my legal career as a criminal lawyer, not really properly understanding nearly all the people that I dealt with in the system, not understanding why my clients self-medicated on drugs and alcohol, not understanding why they were very quick to respond in an angry fashion to small stressful situations. Everything was exaggerated and large. And often my response then would be very poor. So if someone was rude to me, I would be rude or impolite back. I wouldn't give them much time. When they were telling me things, even important things, I probably didn't properly listen. And that film, more or less overnight, impacted on how I practice law as a lawyer, how my business practice law, I guess how I was as a person. I think even with my own children, I reflected in some of the very bad practices I was involved in terms of not controlling my children, but I guess acting in a way that was the adult knows best type of thing, and not really hearing their wants or their needs. So yeah, so overnight that film was the epiphany, and really changed the course of what I do.
That's terribly interesting, Iain, because it sounds like you're describing really quite a fundamental shift, not just in your attitude, but in your personality. And there must have been something going on within you, not just the film, but something that was kind of boiling up, really ready for a change and this major development in your life.
Yeah, as I say, with Leslie coming up, it was purely because I run a community cinema. So if you've never met her, so Leslie won a BAFTA for East is East. She produced East is East, the film. And she is probably one of the most inspiring and powerful people I've ever met in my life. And effectively, inadvertently inspired me to change. So although I didn't understand about the trauma when I met her, and hers was really about educating very young people, but it is all interlinked, because by the failure to educate children about social emotional learning, they probably fail to properly understand empathy, equality, And all the learnings that Leslie was given, it was with Sir Ken Robinson, Meryl Streep is involved in their charity, Susan Sarandon, so all these superstars are involved with Leslie, is that if people don't properly understand or are educated gently in this stuff, because it's gentle learning for very young people, then they may grow up, as I see with a lot of clients, in stressful households where they don't know any other way. So I used to loosely believe that my clients who would come in who were young, involved in hitting their girlfriends or taking drugs and alcohol, did that through learned behavior only, rather than necessarily acquired behavior through neurology or psychology, if that makes sense. Again, I'll bow to your great knowledge on this, but what I now understand and see is clients being told all the time about being responsible for their actions, but because of their stress, that they're not response able, so they don't have that ability, and therefore their culpability for me lessens. It doesn't mean to say it's okay, so it's never an excuse that someone has a high level of trauma in their childhood to say, well, they can do what they want. I think it's a very important explanation that the justice system misses out. And it's a key, for me, it's key because it deals with probably 80 to 90% of who I see every single day in court. There's a lot of people who do things that are wrong, and it's not an excuse, as I say, but it's an explanation. And some people might just be greedy. They may have other issues going on which isn't related to childhood trauma, but most of what I see, I think, links back to what happened to them rather than what was wrong with them.
Thank you. And in a way, you've begun to describe how you changed your practice arising from this kind of fundamental development in your awareness. Could you say a bit more about that, though?
Yeah, sure. As I say, I suddenly saw who was actually in front of me. So when I was in my office, when I was in court speaking to people, I listened a lot harder and actually heard what they had to say. I allowed space and time for them to maybe tell me a little bit more. I didn't, for example, score people in terms of their trauma. I wasn't counting the number of ACEs from someone, but often in the social work reports, it would be quietly whispered that they had a difficult childhood. They wouldn't enumerate the trauma in someone's life. They wouldn't regard it as relevant, or they didn't seem to regard it as relevant. So I guess I probed a little bit harder, but not by saying, have you ever been sexually abused or who's hurt you? But it'd be often, for example, more neutral questions. Do you know why you drink so much? Why do you think you rely on drugs? And why do you take it so chronically? Have you any idea why you do that? And often if they feel comfortable, and by then I'd always had a pretty good relationship with clients. So I think they felt safe. But more often than not, they would tell me things that they hadn't told me before. Frankly, probably because they may have felt I would have shamed them, or it would be embarrassing, or that I wouldn't understand, or that maybe my empathy levels were poor. But the change in me in terms of how I practiced and how I spoke, I think resulted in a change in terms of the information I got, but also the reactions I got from the clients. So James Docherty, I don't know if he's been on your show, but he worked for the Violence Reduction Unit, is an absolutely incredible human being. But he said to me, I said, I don't understand why my clients are now telling me, often apropos of nothing, and often after the court proceedings, so there was no gain for them, that they were telling me that they'd been sexually abused when they were young. And I'm not asking them this question. And he said, it's because they know that I won't shame them. And I found that incredibly powerful. And it's incredible, although it sounds bad to say it's a burden, but I don't like to hear that my clients have been sexually abused or had terrible childhoods. But it's also a privilege that people feel confident enough to tell you that. And I guess in response, what my response is, which wouldn't be before, is to try and be empathetic. So I don't say I understand, but I might say I'm really sorry to hear that happen. And then I try as best I can to signpost them for what help is available. Often in drugs recovery in Scotland, certainly very poor. We keep people alive when the lock's on. So there's been a big campaign by the Scottish Government to concentrate on the lock's on. So that's good. We keep people alive, but we don't help them live, and we don't help them heal, and we don't help them recover. And so there's a big gap in that. But anyway, that's maybe beyond the question you asked. But yeah, so I guess it was very much a change in me and a change in how we viewed people. And I think that ended up being a very positive thing for most of the clients.
Thank you. I think you're a very modest man, actually, Iain. For example, you slipped in that you ran a community cinema as if that were nothing in its own right, but was clearly part of the whole engagement that you had with the world.
Well, yeah, that's probably one of my first loves is cinema and film. It turned out about 10 years ago, I found out I was dyslexic. Didn't know that when I was young, didn't know that was at school or when I was at university. And it explained an awful lot. So I hated reading. I still am brilliant at reading it. So for example, all the books by Gabor Mate or Bezel van der Kolk or all the great writers, I have to force myself to read them. But obviously I can read. I'm just a very slow reader. So film was always my default. So me and a group of friends, so it's not just me that runs it, there's a group of us that run it, run a local free community cinema. So we bring the community together. And it's a really great thing. We stay in a small village. So that aspect of my life, I guess, has always been there. But it's just because I enjoy the medium of film and visual art rather than necessarily writing, which I do love poetry. I love reading, but I'm just not very good at it.
But I tend to agree with David, Iain, and it's interesting that David comments on your humility and actually you dismiss the achievement of that's just what you do. And my guess is that's partly why the clients relate to you, that sense of not pushing yourself into a position of having power over them or authority, but just relating to them as human beings.
Well, I don't know, there's probably some adverse childhood experience for me is why I'm not very good at taking any praise, so we'll not go into that.
So Iain, as you were talking, I was wondering how easy have you found it to get other parties in the legal system to actually listen to the message that you have? Yeah,
so that's a good question. And as I say, there's now a little group of us. So in December 2020, there's three lawyers who have got together. We now have others who are either professors or lecturers at university who have got involved with us. We've got a psychotherapist from the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. We have a peer mentor in the form of James Docherty, who's a project manager there, who's very inspirational, a school teacher, a BAFTA-winning filmmaker who's involved. So we're a disparate band of people now, but at the time, around 2018, I didn't really know anyone else doing this or talking about it. I didn't plan to do this, but I just thought, I think lawyers need to know about this. So in around April 2018, I wrote an article for the Scottish Law Journal. 16,000 lawyers get this journal every month. And I wrote this in conjunction with Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk, who's one of the leading attachment specialists in the UK, I think, if not the world. And she helpfully set out about adverse childhood experiences, the impact and why that was relevant for lawyers. So wrote the article, dyslexic man, thinking, brilliant, that's a good turn, that's the job done. But of course, most people didn't read it. A lot of people that did read it thought it was a load of rubbish. And my wife, Ishbel, pointed out that that was really only the start of the campaign rather than the end of it. Although I didn't plan on going a campaign, I started going to meetings. We created what was called the West Lothian ACES Hub. That was made up of people from health, justice and education, because we could see that holistically, it wasn't just one area that needed to change, that everybody had to work together to understand the impact of trauma. The local council were persuaded to buy the film license for resilience. And we went into loads of different environments, hospitals, schools, primary schools, Children's Reporters Office, prosecutors, the police, and we basically showed the film, which lasts an hour, and then explained to them the impact it had on us. So rather than telling them what they should do, I would just tell them the story of what I did and why I thought what I did was different and why it was a good thing for me. And then they got to decide which clever ways in their own industry, social work, or whatever area, it wasn't for me to tell them what they should do. And so at first, friends and colleagues were saying things like, "Are you feeling okay? Is everything all right?" As if because of the language I was using, it seemed not shocking, but odd. I would talk about love. I would talk about compassion. I'd talk about empathy and kindness, and why we couldn't punish people into a better way of being, and why we really had to look in a journey of recovery for people, in particular young people. But in my view, we shouldn't give up on a 50-year-old who's addicted to heroin, who was sexually abused when they were 8. You know, people, for me, I think, I'm not saying it's salvageable or fixable, those are the wrong words, but I think we need to be more compassionate to whoever, even if their behaviours are poor. But they're all, as you guys know, that they're manifestations of behaviours which are, you know, from a cause, from somewhere often very dark. And I didn't really understand that before, and I've got a better understanding now. But I'm learning every day.
It's interesting, isn't it, as you're talking about using words like love and compassion, that actually there is a bit of a taboo around, those ideas within the criminal justice system. We're much more comfortable with people being angry and punitive, even when they're the staff. It seems it's much harder to get people to listen to words like love and compassion. And certainly when I worked in prison, the officers used to get called care bears in a disparaging way for talking about having a more compassionate approach. So I can only think that working amongst the community in a profession where that isn't the norm for it to be spoken about, that you must have had to have or develop quite a thick skin to, I can imagine there would be ridicule at times.
Yeah, it felt like that. And I know some behind my back would say, "Oh, here he goes again with this trauma pish," or just, I guess, because what you don't know, you don't know. So it was always from a point of view of, I didn't really resent any of that because I got the fact that they didn't get it. So sometimes they'd say, "Look, I know you're going on about this trauma stuff, but all they need is a wee job, a wee bird, which is a girlfriend, and a wee house, and they'll be sorted." But that's tomorrow's domestic abuser, because it doesn't resolve at the root of what their difficulty is. Mm-hmm. So the house and the money and the job and the girlfriend isn't going to cure the difficulties they experience if they're struggling with life from their childhoods. And it just James Docherty talks about, what you don't transform, you transmit, and I can see that, and I didn't see it before. So yeah, it was a difficult thing, but actually, as I say, it wasn't planned, so therefore I didn't feel disappointment when I was getting closed doors or ridicule or anything like that. But I became fairly resolved that, and still am, that basically this is so important, that being hurt about doors closing or people thinking I'm daft, it's much bigger, certainly much bigger than me, and much bigger than the trauma-aware law group that I'm in. It's just such a big thing that I keep going. The Scottish government, I have to say, have been very, very good. They probably around 2018 started their own trauma-informed awareness campaigns. They worked with NHS, NEST, National Education Service of the NHS. So we have Caroline Bruce, who's the head of trauma in Scotland. She's a fully qualified psychologist, and she is brilliant, along with her colleagues and team. So they're very good at sending out education both to schools, teachers, and into the community. So it has become less of a weird thing to talk about. But I think until what I talk about in court is said by everyone, then it's not yet ready. And until judges understand it's not yet ready. But I want what I do to be very mundane, to be very normal, that I don't win awards, which aren't important, are not really relevant. But so it'd be better that the trophy at the end of this would be just for everyone to understand it, to react to it, so that the key is not waiting, because the judges always say, you've got to change when they're dealing with someone in the dock. You've got to do better. You've got to change. And in my head, all I'm thinking is, no, actually, we've got to change, because we've been doing the same thing over and over and getting the same result, which is recidivism, mass incarceration. Scotland has the highest incarceration rate in Western Europe. Scotland, our little country, has the highest drugs deaths amongst the world. We are 3 times more than England and about 9.5 times more than the European average. This is Scotland. It's a small country. And yet, because we don't look at things differently and we're slow to change, we allow this devastation to continue to happen. So the reality is the system has got to change. The judges have got to change. The lawyers, the fiscals, the police, the social workers, the healthcare system, the education system. Stop putting kids in front of lights to look at the light switch, to think about their bad behaviour. Get the teacher to switch on the light in their head to think, why is this child behaving poorly, disruptively? What is going on in that child's life? And then you start getting, I think, a better community.
Really shocking statistics there, Iain, actually. I hadn't realised that Scotland came out so poorly in terms of, I knew there was a problem around substance misuse, but actually I was quite shocked with some of those other figures. And yeah. I thought the advice your wife gave you was very, very good advice as well. The idea that you have to keep going and keep saying the same message repeatedly, because I think it's very easy to feel not bored, but almost like, is there anyone left to hear this message, because I've said it so many times, and yet you still have to keep going with this message.
Yes, no, so absolutely. It's as I said, I don't like the sound of my own voice. Thankfully, this is a radio rather than a TV type interview, but yeah, you end up saying the same things, but actually I'm saying them because a lot of people still haven't heard them. Or if they've heard them, maybe hearing them a second time, it maybe sinks in. Mm-hmm. I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I'm just saying all I can do is explain what I see and how I see changes happening. And I usually do it through like stories of what happens in court. So, I can share that with you as well, but just happy to be led by you and what you want me to talk about.
That's brilliant. I mean, if you've got examples of times where you think that's really made a difference to your practice in court and maybe helped get a different outcome for somebody, that'd be great to hear that.
So there's a young lad, we'll call him Brendan. This is about just before COVID. He appears on a warrant, so he's arrested by the police for breaching what we call a community payback order. In this case, it was supervision by a social worker and unpaid work, and he hadn't done it. And by failing to do it and not turning up, a warrant was issued for his arrest. He's arrested. It turns out when I meet him in the cells in Edinburgh, he had been homeless. He'd been taking drugs and really struggling with life. But by the time I met him, he'd got himself involved with the Rock Trust, who are an organisation, I think they may be UK-wide, but helped him with his housing and getting some furniture. He worked with an organisation called Aid and Abet, who deal with people coming out of prison to make sure they've got benefits, make sure they've got prescriptive medication, and try to organise houses so that they deal with the chaos when someone leaves prison. I know a lot of your stuff is about people who are locked up, but obviously they then come out of prison, hopefully. Mm-hmm. And so Aid and Abet helped. So they helped him. He went to see his general practitioner, got prescriptive medication. He engaged with his social worker. So things were going, by the time he appeared from custody, things were actually going very well for him, and he was doing really well. I also described to the judge not only about how well he was doing, but his history of trauma. He was born into chaos. Both parents were addicted to substances. Father left the scene quite early on, and then regrettably his mum went through a series of different men who were abusive to her, and no doubt probably to him. He was in and out of care. By the age of 10, he was drinking alcohol. By the age of 11, heavily involved in cannabis and alcohol. And by the age of 13, his first go of heroin was delivered by his mother. So I tell the judge this, and in a very busy court, she says, well, what are you asking me to do? I said, well, I'd like you to praise him. And she went, sorry? As if I thought she hadn't heard me. So in this very busy court, which was then suddenly quiet, I boomed out, I'd like you to praise him. And she went, praise him? I'm thinking about jailing him. I said, well, he's under 21. You can't jail him. You need to get reports. Well, I'll remand him for reports. I said, well, don't remand him, because I've explained, he now has a house. He's got medication. He's getting mentoring. He's seeing his doctor. All right, so away you go then. 4 weeks, and she let him out. 4 weeks later, I come armed with a report from the Rock Trust, aid and abet, his doctor, and importantly, his social worker. But his social worker had narrated all the terrible things that had happened in his childhood, just as I had described them. And as I'm ready to get up, I've got my gown on in court. I'm ready to get up to go to battle with the judge. And she told me to sit down. And in my head, I thought, here we go. She told the boy to stand up. And for 10 minutes, she praised him. She saw the person, probably for the first time before her, saw his difficulties and his struggles, and quite rightly praised him for the efforts he made. And she gave him another chance, a further chance on the order, and continued the order and wished him luck. And as we left court and went out, he said nobody had ever spoken to him like that in his life. And my one regret about that little story is, although I see this judge quite regularly, I've never told her the effect that she had on him. Now, it doesn't cure someone new. That interaction in court doesn't cure people. Court is not the place for healing, in my view. In 2019, I brought 2 American judges over with the assistance of Community Justice Scotland, and they run what are called therapeutic courts, or procedural justice courts, where they treat everyone with dignity and respect, and they do things a little bit differently. One of them triages for mental health within the court, so they have a mental health nurse and practitioners, and they triage to see whether someone should go into hospital or what help they can give them. Now, for me, the court is not the venue to help people or to help people into recovery, but it might be the kickstart, it might be the pivot which can change someone. So a judge praising someone, a judge being kind to someone, seeing who's before them, might be that little magical education moment to say, I'm normally terrified from a judge, but now that judge has seen me, I'm going to make the effort. Now, it doesn't always happen in that moment, but for me, what they've then got to do in starting that compassion journey is to persevere with the people, to give them hope, and to keep going with them when they fall on their arse, which inevitably a lot of people do, because as you guys know, there's no overnight cure for trauma. And it can take months, years, a lifetime, but the choice is treating people badly, treating people with disdain, carrying out retribution as opposed to rehabilitation. Putting in place, firstly, punishment rather than healing certainly doesn't help fix anyone suffering trauma. It just pushes them down, and that, in my view, is we should be lifting them up. It doesn't mean to say we don't necessarily punish poor behaviour. I appreciate some people have a thirst for that, but if the primary function for me would be, in particular with lower level crime, would be rehabilitation. And now, thankfully, in Scotland, we can come on to that later, but thankfully in Scotland, as of the 26th of January last year, they have changed the system. So we had a hand in that, but we campaigned quite vigorously to have the Scottish Sentencing Council take into account traumatic childhoods, adverse childhood experiences, and they now do that with every case involving an under 25-year-old at each level of court. And that affects not only mitigation, so it makes it less bad, but also culpability. So they recognise that people have got the capacity to change. So the primary function of that sentencing guideline is to focus on rehabilitation rather than retribution. And it's a massive thing. I don't think the judges realise just how massive it is because they've not been trained on trauma. They have a toolkit now as of November last year, but at a deep level, they need to understand trauma and understand the people who are before them and then they'll start giving out fairly poignant and appropriate disposals, because once they understand it, I think they'll do something differently. So that's a very long answer.
No, well, just, I found that very moving, actually, that account of, the young guy in court and how your intervention perhaps enabled something very different to happen. And it's really lovely to hear that kind of story, because too often on these podcasts, David and I end up exploring some of the more toxic elements of institutional organisational life, and it's really nice to hear something that's quite heartwarming. But I wondered, in terms of your business, have you has it impacted on your business at all? Is it
so traditionally
business?
Traditionally, if a 17-year-old, often boys, as you probably realise, probably I would say about 80% of those 80 to 90% going through our justice system are male. So if a 17-year-old boy walked through my door clutching what we call a petition or a complaint with charges on it, indicating that they were involved in housebreakings at a very early age, historically, from a financial point of view, I would be rubbing my hands thinking, here's the golden goose. And now when they come through with the same scenario, I end up thinking, I wonder what's going on with his life. I wonder how he got here. So I would never encourage anyone to commit crime, but I probably didn't spend a lot of time discouraging it. So in terms of that now, because of the signposting to the local college, to support groups, to doctors, often people that can help them, encourage them to engage with social work. Probably historically didn't really do that. Almost it was a game that you've got to play the game, as it were, you've got to go with them, but it was part of the system. Whereas now I say, look, these people actually really, really want to help you and take the help. So that 17-year-old coming through my door historically would lead to 20, 30 cases, netting me a lot of money. But the nice thing, which wasn't designed or planned, is although that person might end his career before it begins, which is obviously for me now part of the aim, he'll send his 10 friends round and say, go and see that lawyer because he cares about what happens. So in an ironic way, rather than having 10 cases from the one boy, I now have 10 new clients who hopefully are only ever going to get into trouble once. Mm-hmm. So I've probably never been busier, but it was, the change was never really with a thought to make more money or make less money. It was just, to me, that it was the right thing to do. And as I say, the courts now see it as the right thing to do. And I think, in fairness to a lot of my colleagues, as I say, none of the lawyers that I know ever really want people to get into trouble, don't want any serious harm to come to anyone, but we probably weren't particularly good at being the person to discourage them, because what we would say is, as we often say, and you hear other people say, that's not my job. I was once criticised by social work for waiting outside the custody suite, waiting for a young man to come out to present him as homeless about 10 metres away in the front desk of a civic centre. And they told me that wasn't my job. And they were right, of course, because I feel it was their job. That was part of their job. But whilst they weren't doing it, I did it. And I think we spend an awful lot of time worrying or thinking about the things that aren't our jobs. So for me, caring about people should be all of our jobs. Reduction of harm should be all of our jobs. And yet we seem to get so stuck in our little silos about, well, that's you that's going to do that, and that's that person that's going to do that. So it's not my job to be a psychologist. It's not my job to be a social worker. It's not my job, in quotations, to fix someone. But I think a human element, I think we can all care a bit more about what we do and do a little bit more. But that's for other people to decide what they want to do. But I certainly don't really appreciate those that overly judge me going an extra yard, as long as it's ethical. So I'm not breaking ethical boundaries. I'm not pretending I'm their friend. They know I'm their lawyer. They don't think I'm anything else. I don't try and be a Superman or superhero. I don't no longer try to rescue people, although probably for the first couple of years, I got that syndrome or that feeling that I could change their lives, and I know that just isn't realistic, and it leads to burnout. So I don't do that. But yeah, I do feel that the idea of it's not your job is very flawed.
Thank you. And you clearly think the application of law would look different if all lawyers were trained to understand the impact of trauma. But I was just thinking, do you think all lawyers are actually open to that, or are the barriers interpersonal barriers that are
so we started our little group in December 2020 on the basis that we were never going to resolve anything top down, so that the policymakers and the lawmakers and the judges were not going to change, and that the only way we were going to make a difference was grassroots and bottom up. So what we did as a group is we went into all 10 law schools in Scotland. There are 10 LLB or law schools in Scotland at university level, and we went in and did talks to all of those 10 universities, either at law schools, law clinics, but to the students, because we thought that's the next generation of lawyers. And we continue to do that each year. And we thought that was a great thing to do. We then got in touch with the Law Society of Scotland and said, look, can we be part of your conference? So they dedicated half a day of their annual conference to trauma. That ended up being quite a big thing. And then we ended up doing talks online, and then we've done recorded talks, and there's resources available. But what we're now doing, we've done this for, I think, over 2 years, is that we've created, through the Law Society of Scotland, an accredited specialist trauma aware course. And that's assisted by great speakers like Caroline Bruce, who's the head of trauma in the government. Other guest speakers we have a public inquiry regarding childhood sexual abuse. People have come along, spoke from that. Children's champions, psychologists, people, I don't like the term lived experience, but people who have experienced their own trauma have shared some of that. And that's a 5 or 6 week course, which is quite intense, but only about 20 or 30 lawyers can do it at a time. Apparently the course is oversubscribed tenfold. So we did, I think, number 2 or 3 of this course yesterday. There was 32 lawyers on it. And they're wanting us to do it now 4 times a year rather than once a year, so that more lawyers get it because of the subscription. And the other bigger practices and firms have asked if we can train all their staff. So I think there's a massive appetite for it now. It's no longer something to have a red face about or to be embarrassed about talking about it, that it's something that people see as really important, that they worry not only for their clients, but they worry for staff, that they worry about how they present to their clients, and that everyone as well, they worry about vicarious trauma. Especially lots of firms deal with claims for sexual abuse or are in the public inquiry for sexual abuse, and how do they effectively have reflective practice about the information that they have to then deal with, and absorb. And I'm not particularly good at it. I know it's maybe one of the questions you wanted to ask later on, but I'm not particularly good at switching off. I'm not particularly good at keeping healthy boundaries, I think, at times, and bringing stuff home and it weighing heavily on your shoulders. But I also then comfort myself by the fact that if I wasn't doing it, then maybe nobody else would. So, but equally, I don't think I can do it on my own. But I'm just saying that it's a consequence to some extent. I think I'll live with, but it does affect other things. It affects your ability to engage properly at home. So that the phrase "you can't pour from an empty cup" springs to mind. So I know I've got to keep healthy. I joined the gym yesterday, threatened to go to today, but I had to race home to come onto the podcast. But I will definitely try and go tomorrow. So I think it's important to obviously keep yourself well, but I think it's very easy to say, I can't get involved in this because it's not professional. I've got to detach myself from my clients' problems because it's not professional. I disagree with that. I think it's important that we attach and that we create relationships, albeit healthy relationships, boundaried in the sense that I'm still a lawyer. I'm not someone's friend. I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not. But I think you can still be a lawyer, but actually create a relationship of trust, which is at a deeper level if you understand about trauma.
Thank you. I'm slightly overwhelmed by the amount that you've been doing, Iain. You've been so active and creative in this field. Yeah, I think you must come back again sometime and go into these aspects of activity in greater detail. But I wanted to ask you how you'd like to see the system change to take into account these histories of trauma. Now, I think you've already mentioned one thing, which was to do with somehow softening the boundaries between the different professions, and placing a greater emphasis upon the relationship across those boundaries. But are there other ways?
Yeah, so I think a holistic approach is important. A holistic understanding of trauma is important in all areas. There has been, in terms of the grassroots movement, the great thing that did happen, I know I've alluded to it, but the Scottish Sentencing Council in January 22 changed the guidelines about young people. So we changed our young people in our system from under 21s to under 25s to reflect at least some ideas of the malleable brain. I know there's arguments to say that it goes on till 30 or beyond, but they've picked 25, which I'll take just now as a starter. And they concentrate on adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma. And then they effectively, although they don't realise they're doing that, give examples of that. So they talk about care experience has to be known and identified, addiction issues, mental health issues, communication needs. And these are, to me, are subcategories of traumatic experiences. So in every case, at every level, High Court, Sheriff Court, Justice of the Peace Court, they identify and look at that trauma and the impact it has both on mitigation and culpability. And that would then lead them to focusing on rehabilitation rather than punishment. So that's a massive change. And that is a systems change, a proper systems change. Requires a bit more training for the judges, but they've started that by a toolkit in November of last year. But they need to change it and understand it. So if I've been a judge for 40 years, then I think how I deal with them is as fair as I can be, and I don't want to change. Why should I change? I am the judge. I am the boss. I decide what happens. Nobody's going to tell me, but of course they are telling them now, because the Sentencing Council is headed by the second highest judge in Scotland, Lady Dorian, and that has been sent to them to follow. If they don't follow that remit, then they'll be appealed and their sentences altered. But in order to change, they need to know why they're changing. They need to understand the trauma. They need to have a response, a change within themselves, and probably more importantly, at the end of that, actually have the ability to do something creative and reactive rather than sending people to jail. And in Scotland, it's a bit of a lottery. Which charities are available? Which services are available? I think Scotland, I could be wrong about this, but Scotland has a very low number of rehab beds for drugs and alcohol, effectively state funded. The others are privately funded, and there's quite a few of them, but you have to have the knowledge and ability to get into that privately funded bed. So it's not like in America, it's not the Betty Ford clinic. It's not, you're spending tens of thousands as an individual, so only rich people get it. But you need to know how your benefits can be placed in rehab. So as I say, we've been brilliant at getting the locks on about keeping people alive. We've been less good at helping them live in a healthy way. Because there's various schools of thoughts, and they seem to suggest they compete with each other. For example, in Scotland, about the abstinence, you're either abstinence orientated or you're treatment related. But actually, there's probably a variety of ways people can be helped. People might not be ready to come off substances people might not want to come off substances because it's the thing that keeps them going. People might want help to come off them, might want rehab. So I think there's not one size fits all, but we're just not very good at having those resources. I mean, I have a dedicated drugs minister who I think is doing her best to try and address that, but there's very limited funds, as you know. There's a recession on, but for me, we should be prioritising of being aware of the trauma, being aware why people take drugs, and if they want help, that we should be able to give them that.
Legal work obviously means lawyers hearing lots of accounts of suffering, both the suffering of victims and also the emotional pain in the histories of those that are coming into contact with the courts. Should lawyers have reflective practice to process their own emotions about the work? You've kind of mentioned already that that's something that can be quite challenging, that you can end up taking the work home, so to speak. Yeah. Should all lawyers be doing reflective practice?
Yeah, I think that'd be good. I think as a general thing, reflective practices are great for not only when things go wrong, but also what you've done well. And just it doesn't need to be trauma related. It could just be how you've dealt with the case and then speak amongst your peers. But and that doesn't need to be criminal law. It can be, as I say, lots of civil law, family law. Can be very it can be very upsetting about the things that are going on in children's cases. It doesn't need to involve sexual abuse for it to be upsetting. Just people's emotions and people's feelings, and I think being able to speak about it in a healthy, safe environment, I think is really important. The lawyers at this child sex abuse inquiry have the benefit of Anne McKechnie, who is a very experienced psychologist, and she's part of their team, and they do debriefs and they do reflective practice, and they talk about it. And I think there is the ability to get therapy or meditation, or just ways of dealing with it. I see a guy now and again who is a great guy. He's involved in the Law Society's trauma course, but he'll do meditation with me, something I never thought I'd want to do or ever do, because I just thought it was a bit airy-fairy, but actually you realise how important it is to do that. But I'm not particularly good myself at avoiding vicarious trauma. I'm not particularly good at processing it. It does floor me at times, but that's no use for my other clients if I'm not able to function properly because I'm upset about a set of circumstances. I've had 16 deaths of clients, drug-related deaths, in the past 2 years. I'm a very small practice. I've had numerous clients and friends, unfortunately, but numerous clients take their own life. And that's always hard to deal with, because in some ways it's not explicable in a way that drug-related death is, but albeit unfair and unacceptable. And these things, they hit you hard. As I say, I don't pretend my clients are my friends, but I'll often try to go to their funerals, and it's quite sad when you go that often nobody else is there. Probably more sad is when you hear and learn about all the things you didn't know about them, their love of music. Some of them have a faith that you didn't think they would have, or just little things that affect you. But the loss of a client, as I say, drug related or to suicide or just with their poor health is very sad, and it happens a lot in criminal law. Unacceptable large amounts.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about that relationship with clients, and I think even outside of you've named sort of family law where there's an involvement with children, personal injury law. Again, lawyers are hearing powerful stories about people, and quite often when people come into contact with lawyers, they're coming into contact because things have gone awry, things aren't going well, and it's really impressive to hear you talking about the relationship that a lawyer has with their client as being a real relationship. I have the same conversations with psychologists that it's still a real relationship. It's a professional relationship, but you invest emotionally in someone, and clearly you can hear that you invest emotionally in your clients and the matter, which I'm sure is part of why your contact's so powerful and meaningful with them. But how have you managed to keep yourself healthy whilst doing this work, Iain?
Yeah, I think the presumption would be that I am healthy, but at times I'm not. So I find it emotionally draining at times, depressing at times. As I say, I've joined the gym. I've not physically been yet, but I cycle. I try to keep sort of some level of fitness. So I cycle with a group of friends. I try and do that every week. I've got a dog, so I go dog walking. Try to do things with the kids, but my kids now are 21, 18 and 16, and certainly it's not quite the same when they're 8, 6 and 4. You know, they don't really need you, and even though you have a desire to be with them, that doesn't always work the same way. So you try to do things as a family. But yeah, I think in the community cinema that you know about, I don't always strike the right balance for my own good health and well-being. I spend a lot of time doing this in terms of campaigning, which I do enjoy, but again, I've had to say no to quite a lot more things because I realise it was taking up an awful lot of time. So time that, for example, we're doing this at lunchtime because I don't want it to affect my business or my business partner feeling I'm not pulling my weight, for example. But it then means that your downtime or free time is less. But I still think it's hugely important. That's why I'm here. I know you've had a lot of very good guests on. I've listened to quite a bit of your podcasts. Prison is something I take really seriously in terms of where people end up and what better outcomes there are. I don't know, I've obviously maybe not got time to speak about this in any detail, but last year, myself, James Docherty and others brought Fritzi Horstman over from America, and Fritzi's in charge of the Compassion Prison Project, and made the Compassion Circle. I don't know if you've seen that little video.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Have you seen that, David? It'd be helpful also for our listeners anyway to hear about it, because it's definitely worth watching if you haven't.
Yeah, so I watched that. I saw it on LinkedIn, and as I say, I've been more disinhibited since I started this campaigning. So my shy dyslexia way of being has now made me a bit more ballsy about just asking, because the worst thing people can say is no. So I approached Fritzi and said, how about coming over to Scotland and start speaking to our people in prison? Yeah, sure, I'll do that. And before I know it, with the help of organisers, there's a group called Tigers. Suzanne Zedek was involved, CIFCO, who are a prison charity in Scotland, James Docherty and several other people. We managed to get Fritzi to come over with her team, and they entered 3 Scottish prisons, all with the permission of the governors. And they did a Compassion Prison Circle. And that in essence is a circle of however many prisoners. I think it was maybe as low as maybe 25, as high as maybe about 60. And they go in a circle, and they know what they're going to share. But they're asked if they want to share and take a step forward if, for example, X, Y, or Z has happened to them. So if they've been shouted at as a child, if they were physically beaten. So effectively, almost like an ACEs score, which, as I say, is not necessarily a good thing. But the purpose of this was to show that the other prisoners, because by the time they step into the circle, they're all physically very close. And they realise that they've got a lot more in common than they thought. And they share an awful lot of pain. And the explanation thereafter, so they're not just left at that. There was an initial 3 other days with Fritzi, and thereafter Cisco, this charity, went in weekly to mentor and educate and help these women and men in the Scottish prisons. And for many it was transformative. It might have just put them on the beginning of a path and a journey. For others, I think their epiphany was huge, and it allowed them to realise about their own pain and not to feel any shame. And as I say, I was privileged enough to be part of it and when I wasn't working, but I'd go in and I see a massive difference. but how that's rolled out across all prisons, I don't know. That for many it might have felt very American, a very, you know, rah-rah and as a show, but it wasn't really a show. It wasn't just a piece of theatre. It was much deeper than that. Once you go on beyond this epiphany of the circle, and yeah, I thought it was huge. But yeah, so the prison work, and we had a conference with Fritzi. She's done films with Jennifer Lopez and Dr. Dre, but her thing now is it's all about prisons. That's what she does. She's like a modern day Elizabeth Fry.
It's a very powerful video, that, actually, and if I can find it online, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Yeah, so it's definitely worth watching. Yeah. But Iain, we've come to the end of time, and we're conscious of you've got an afternoon's work ahead of you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, and actually really inspirational and uplifting. A nice contrast to some of the stories we've had to tell.
Thanks to you both, and thanks for the work that you do in providing people with information. I've found your podcast very inspiring, so thank you.
Great conversation, Iain. Many thanks, and really good to meet you.
Good to meet you both. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.